I have experienced fever dreams less vivid and demented than 1983's Carnival Magic, and I feel the need to establish that up front alongside putting this warning on screen throughout this review because, to be honest, I don't entirely know what to make of this thing. It's literally supposed to be a kids' film, but I feel like making a kid sit through this thing would be akin to committing one of the forbidden experiments. I'm getting ahead of myself a bit though, so maybe we should wind back a little. Carnival Magic is a 1983 kids' adventure movie directed by veteran exploitation master Al Adamson. Al, for the majority of his 23-year career in filmmaking, had predominantly bedded himself into horror and sexploitation picks such as Dracula vs. Frankenstein or Lash of Lust. But for reasons that have ultimately been lost to time and are frankly too bewildering to contemplate, after completing work on his last pair of pictures, Nurse Sherry and Death Dimension, Al decided that he wanted a new challenge and set his sights on wanting to produce a kids' film to play solely at matinees. At that time, the matinee slot for kids' films, despite being understated, was surprisingly popular, and you could make good money putting films on as part of a double feature for parents to drop their kids off to for some screen time babysitting. So what happens when you take a filmmaker 22 years into their career as a graphic and gory sex exploitation director and set him up making a movie that's core demographic probably couldn't even do their times tables? I'm sure there's no overlap between those two audiences. Well, you get Carnival Magic. The film was shot over 3 weeks in 1980 in South Carolina at the Peach Festival Carnival, with the main star being Trudy, an aging female chimp who had been deemed too old to be used in the film safely. Chimps have a habit of, not giving a fuck past a certain point of maturity. And this was illustrated perfectly well when Trudy had had enough of filming one day and full-on headbutted a script advisor while on set, putting the guy in the hospital for several days. Nevertheless, the shoot was cheap and cheerful, and after that the film spent 3 years in both post-production and distribution tendering before making its way up to screens on a limited run, where it bombed hard and vanished into the ether, being considered lost for the best part of 26 years. So, with that in mind, what's this absolutely mental monkey movie actually about? Well, Carnival Magic takes place at a small-time travelling fair owned by a down-on-his-luck carnival operator, Stoney. In the opening of the film, it's established that the carnival has landed on hard times and that, without a major attraction to help shake things up, the carnival will have to close at the end of the season. From here, we're introduced to two of Stoney's biggest carnival attractions: Kirk, a wild animal expert who may or may not be mistreating his animals, and a mysterious quiet magician called Markov. Kirk and Markov don't see eye to eye, the main reason being that Markov continually keeps sneaking into Kirk's animal tent and staring out Kirk's tigers. Kirk claims that whenever Markov does this, the animals flip out and basically refuse to follow his instructions anymore. It's revealed that Markov in fact has some kind of psychic or telepathic ability that allows him to read people's minds, hypnotise and influence people, and most critically, it allows him to communicate with animals. While the film doesn't explicitly say what Markov and the tigers discuss, it's clear that Markov has some influence over teaching them about respect. And that annoys Kirk, who basically informs Stoney that he either needs to get rid of Markov or he'll quit. Stoney's not left with much of a choice due to Kirk being the carnival's main draw, and he heads over to give Markov his papers. Stoney tells Markov he can stay till the end of the week, but Markov tells Stoney he'll be gone by the morning. That night, Markov takes a walk out in the woods, but something's not quite right. He's talking to someone, or rather, something. Specifically, he's telling whoever or whatever that it's becoming increasingly hard for him to hide them from public attention, and that he doesn't know how much longer he's going to be able to keep it up for. While on the way back to the caravan, he passes by a tent and spots Ellen, otherwise known as Buddy, asleep in one of the benches. Ellen is Stoney's daughter and runs the ticket booth around the carnival. Ellen's mother wasn't built for carny lifestyles and ran away when Ellen was very young, breaking Stoney's heart and leading him to only ever call Ellen Bud, and dressing her as Mask in order to stop Stoney from feeling quite so upset about the situation. But Ellen's not happy with the way things are as they sit. Markov wakes her up and tries to get her into bed, but as the pair are leaving the tent, Markov's secret is revealed. Markov has a monkey, A talking monkey. A talking monkey who can do magic tricks, reads magazines, and is domesticated to the point that it can cook a meal, sweep floors, and much, much more. This is Alex, a monkey that Markov trained in the ways of psychic and telekinetic abilities with his unfortunately passed away wife, Sarah. The pair had been travelling together since Sarah's death, and Markov is fiercely protective of where Alex goes and what he gets up to. Ellen is astounded by Alex's monkey magic and begs Markov to show Stoney, as he's convinced that this'll be the act that'll save the carnival. But apart from the fact that Markov desperately doesn't want to turn Alex into a sideshow attraction, he tells Ellen that he's been sacked and will be leaving in the morning. After some backing and forthing with Ellen, Markov decides to leave the decision up to Alex. He explains the situation and effectively says that if he doesn't want to be in the limelight, that's understandable, but that him and Markov can only really stay together as long as Markov has the funds to keep Alex fed, and he can't guarantee that that'll be the case if they have to leave the carnival. Alex says he wants to perform, and so the next day Ellen drags Stoney to Markov's trailer where, begrudgingly, Stoney has a sit-down meeting with Markov. Markov introduces Alex to Stoney, and in a bizarre turn of events, Stoney seems way more astounded that Alex can cook a meal and sweep floors than the fact that Markov literally has a coherently conversing chimp in his possession. In either case, Stoney snaps up the chance to put a magic charismatic talking monkey on the bill, and Alex and Markov are rebranded as Alexander the Great and the Magnificent Markov. And with that, we're treated to an elongated magic act between Markov and Alex in which the monkey largely looks confused and terrified. In the audience of the opening show is a somewhat sinister looking man in a suit who, rather stony-faced, quietly makes notes on the show for its full duration. We'll get back to him shortly, but for now the show was a success, and Stoney and his PR man David are dizzy at the possibilities that Alex and Markov could open up for the carnival. They immediately begin working up a merch and branding campaign centred around the pair. Markov, meanwhile, goes for a woodland walk when a fellow carnie, Kate, asks if she can tag along for the trip. The pair introduce themselves and Kate shows a clear interest in Markov, who expresses that he isn't really in the headspace for a relationship. He elaborates that he and Sarah were married and expecting their first child together when a freak accident killed Sarah and her unborn child. And because of that, he just isn't ready to start something new. Meanwhile, Alex steals a fucking car and goes on a crazy car chase with a woman in the back seat while being chased by the cops. In what is arguably one of the most bizarre scenes this film throws up, we spend almost 5 to 10 minutes racing around with Alex, and then that scene just ends. And it's never referenced or mentioned again. It's like the film got hijacked briefly and then had to run a gaslighting campaign to convince you it didn't just show an extended monkey car chase. We get an extended heart-to-heart between Markov and Ellen about Ellen's mum and Markov's dead wife. Alex breaks into Kate's tent and steals her bra while she's sleeping. Hilarity ensues. And then we cut back to Kirk, who's been hitting the booze pretty hard in light of Markov and Alex's success. Because they've been doing so well, Stoney's been prioritising them over him, and because of that he feels his influence over the carnival is waning. That, combined with his animals increasingly misbehaving for him, has left him in a place where he's beginning to have a serious confidence issue, and has hit the bottle to cope. This is a kids' film. And it's here that we begin to get into our third act. As Stoney and David begin to kick into overdrive with the marketing of Alex and Markov, and David works up the courage to ask Ellen out on a date, we get introduced once again to the mysterious suited man who made notes at Alex's first show. This is Dr. Poole, a scientist interested in studying Alex as he believes him to be the missing link. Markov refuses, and from there the stakes go off the chart, as Poole shifts from "we want to study him for a few days" to "we're gonna vivisect him and harvest his organs if we so much as get a second alone with that damn dirty ape." And he's willing to go through nefarious means to do so. In a dumbfounding finale, for lack of a better word, will Dr. Poole get his hands on Alex's monkey magic? Will Dave and Ellen finally get it together? And will Stoney manage to make enough cash to save the carnival from closure? All this and more will probably be answered if you check out Carnival Magic. And honestly, I know the words disorienting and wild get thrown around a lot these days, but that's the only way I can honestly describe this film. The actual plot is pretty simplistic. In essence, it's a bit of an E.T. ripoff, though This is a bit of an interesting situation as the film was shot in 1980 and E.T. didn't come out until 1982. So my guess is they didn't intend to make an E.T. knockoff, but kind of shaped it into something of an E.T. knockoff during its elongated post-production session. In either case, the end results really do feel almost like a dream. Like, if someone explained this film to you and you didn't know it existed, you'd swear it was someone misremembering something or just making it up. The script's plot is pretty simple. This is basically a family drama comedy for most of the runtime, with the kidnapping and rescue adventure part of the film being relegated largely to the final act. But how we travel through this piece is positively ADHD driven. There's a 3-act structure largely pinned by Markov's relationship with Kirk, with the opening act being Markov being sacked in favour of Kirk and Alex's rise in the scene, the second act being Kirk's downfall and the rise of Markov and Alex, and the third act being Kirk's full collapse and Markov's rescue attempt of Alex. But that basic plot is punctuated by a hell of a lot of padding, heart-to-hearts where similar information is exchanged over and over again, and it's one of the rare instances where this script feels like the writers want the characters to go one way and the characters are almost disagreeing with their writers, which is bizarre. The writers seemingly really want Markov to date someone, whether it's Kate or Ellen, but Markov flat out refuses, and even by the end credits he doesn't really end up going with anybody, despite the film vying for it throughout the entire runtime. I mean, it's an interesting approach to purposefully mislead your audience with themes that literally won't be elaborated on beyond the 10 to 15 minutes that they're explored, but I don't know if it's conducive to a decent narrative spinner. Given that this is a G-rated movie, the film deals with a lot of themes that absolutely aren't suitable for kids, or rather, themes that kids don't really want to deal with in a talking monkey carnival film. We see domestic abuse, complex talks about feelings of abandonment, gender dysphoria, and comments on gender identity. There's a scene where Kirk gets gorily mauled by a tiger, alcoholism and addiction, vivisection, depression, sexually inappropriate conversations, and much more. And I'm not saying that those themes can't have their place in a kids' film. They absolutely can do if they're handled with the appropriate level of maturity that a kids' audience can digest without becoming confused, bored, or upset. But instead, Adamsons' exploitation roots shine through here, and it appears that he just couldn't keep himself from introducing what, by his standards, were light exploitation elements, but by kids' film standards would be almost like cutting to random clips from Sarlo. And when the film isn't doing these kitchen sink serious heart-to-heart moments, it's flip-flopping directly in the opposite direction, with things like the monkey car chase, or a moment where it's implied Alex molests a nurse, or at one point near the very end of the film there's just a full-blown street parade that happens for no real reason other than, we gotta end the film some way. To me, Alex's kidnapping happens way too late in the film. I'd have brought that forward to around halfway into the second act, leaving the third act to set up the rescue attempt and all the drama around what happens when they find Alex, with proper closure to Kirk, Alex, Ellen, David, Kim, Kate and Stoney's plotlines. Because what happens here is the film introduces everyone, piss-arses about for the entirety of the second half of the first act and opening half of the second act, then remembers it has to set up a kidnapping, which it does near the very end of the second act, meaning the third act is pretty much entirely bogged down by having to execute the kidnapping, then having to execute the rescue mission, meaning that by the time all's said and done, there's about 5 minutes to wrap everyone's storylines up. Not nearly enough time to do these characters any kind of justice. Character development too goes to the wall here. The only character who really gets anything close to an arc is Ellen, who starts the movie having to hide her femininity, and across the runtime we see her open up about her feelings on wanting to be able to embrace a more feminine lifestyle. She meets David, and by the end of the picture she's engaged and fully out as a feminine lady that she's always wanted to be, with full acceptance and reconciliation with her father. And you know what? That one arc is decently handled. The rest of it is bollocks. Barring Kirk, who goes from being a sober arsehole to being a drunk and presumably arrested arsehole, all the other characters pretty much end the film more or less where they started. Top end, they may have started the film with a minor bugbear that, without any effort or challenge to the character, is magically resolved by the end. And the dialogue's absolutely all over the place as well. I don't believe that Alex's lines for this were scripted. I think they assembled an edit and just got someone who was around in the dubbing facility to mumble and grumble whatever came to mind based on what was happening. In some cases, there's a disconnect between what Alex is saying and what's actually happening on screen. Sometimes it's subtle, but sometimes it's a clear show that whoever is dubbing this film has no context as to what's actually happening in the scene. The cast dialogue is awkward and repetitious, not a tremendous amount of plot progression is spoken about in the first 2 acts of this film. Points are just raised, re-raised, and re-re-raised with minor additional pieces of info bolted on each time. Some scenes have absolutely no point other than to readdress earlier raised points, and due to the poor script structuring, we find ourselves in scenarios, the introduction of Dr. Poole is the one that immediately springs to my mind, where they establish things, then forget about those established things for upwards of 20 minutes before coming back to it again and then having to re-establish what they've already established because too much time has passed without them doing anything with the points they've tried to instigate. It kills time, but my god, it's exhausting. All these elements combine together to create a script that should be straightforward and easy to execute, but instead ends up chronically going off message and has to repeatedly reintroduce and re-establish plot points because it keeps going off the beaten path. It's unevenly paced, has a beyond questionable tone behind it, and introduced plot lines and imagery that I won't forget anytime soon. The script was written by Mark Weston, Bob Levine and Elvin Feltner, and if you can believe it, this was their first and only writing credits. And in the case of Bob and Elvin, this was the only thing they ever did in the film industry. Mark, on top of his writing credit, managed to have 9 acting credits, and rather ominously, Carnival Magic was his last performing credit too. And to be fair, I could absolutely believe that someone would star in this film and then decide they would never want to appear on film again. The film was directed by Adamson, and as mentioned, he has an illustrious career in exploitation and sexploitation films, with around 30-ish directing credits under his belt and 7 writing credits. His work is often defined as some of the strangest and wildest movies in cinema history. Adamson would go on to direct one final film after this, Lost, also known as Buddy and Skipper on its home video release. And the combination bombing of that film and Carnival Magic was enough to put Adamson out of the film business entirely. He went into working in real estate, where he'd remain right up until his death in 1995 at the age of 66. And on the direction front, while I know a lot of people will take potshots at Adamson for his less than stellar output, I think Carnival Magic is a corralled production. He's been able to use the elements he has available in a fairly complementary way, and his coordination of the various crews and cast, while maybe a bit chaotic, has at least produced something of a professional looking output. I have seen a lot worse come out of this era of filmmaking. That being said, is it good direction? No, it is not. This isn't a pretty film by any mark, and while being able to mobilise and organise a cast and crew effectively is the main job of a director, being able to turn out a product that doesn't look like arse is a close second. And while he has somewhat managed the former, it's inescapable that the end product looks, for lack of a better word, sweaty. There's a constant feeling of things being rushed or some kind of madness happening off screen, presumably because they had an old chimpanzee headbutting and starting knife fights with the crew members in between takes, but probably also because they were heavily limited on extras, heavily restricted on what they could and couldn't do while filming on an active and busy funfair, and slowly coming to the realisation that they'd written something that wouldn't be out of place in a David Lynch film that again had a target audience of small children. Despite feeling like a snuff film charting a chimp's last known whereabouts for most of the runtime, Adamson's films always have a decent heart running under the surface, and I'll absolutely admit that some of the scenes between Markov, Kate and Ellen are absolutely wonderfully handled. Adamson really seems to know how to get the best out of his cast, and even when the cast weren't A-game amazing, he's still able to get them to a place where they could be managed, which is a critical and important skill to have as a filmmaker. Even in this film's worst looking parts, it still has heart, which I think is what endeared me to it so much. Well, that and the monkey car chase, with the police. On the cine front, it's ugly. As soon as the opening shots of the movie revved up, my immediate thought was that I'd accidentally loaded She-Freak into my player, but no. And comparing this film to She-Freak on the cine front is a bit of an insult, because She-Freak's cine was actually quite delightful. For 1967. Carnival Magic was shot some 13 years later and released 16 years later, and it looks like a late 60s movie. Which is incredible, because the leap in technological advancements, not just in how we understand cinematography, but in the camera and other tech that we used between the late 60s and early 1980s, was a positive revolution. A revolution that seemingly passed Al Adamson by. Shots are flat, lifeless, there's maybe a handful of shots of the carnival that look passably good, but the vast majority of sequences are shot for necessity rather than form. They're minimally constructed with very little variety and barely any consideration for composition. While some of the day-for-night footage is handled somewhat amicably, most of the lighting is shot to be as broad and plain as possible. I don't know if they originally planned to do something stylised with the flat profile they shot in, but I'd be lying if I said that this film didn't look and feel like it came from another age than the one it was made in. The editor in me was captivated by it, but if you're used to pixel-perfect mainstream cinematography, or you're one of those weirdos who picks up on continuity issues and holds it up as an example of how shit the studios are for not even being able to create a totally faultless, unique experience, you're probably going to have a nervous breakdown over this movie. Performance-wise, I mean, Trudy the Chimp, when not attacking the cast and crew, is decidedly charming as Alex, though if you ever want a movie to highlight why regulations on animals working in film need to be as tight as possible, this is the film to show that. In the 80s, people probably wouldn't have batted an eye, but by modern standards, there were several scenes where I winced as she got chained up and is clearly distressed by large numbers of people making noise. It's a product of its time. And it's not okay. Don Stewart as Markov is probably the best performer here. Given he's being asked to work with a script that could best be described as Mad Libs, he gives a very decent performance, delivering his lines with a quiet sincerity, and when he needs to play deep, he really hits the notes required. It's a shame the rest of the film undercuts that with stuff like a chimp car chase scene, but he does a decent job and really shines. My only criticism is his physical presence is a little underplayed here. He's supposed to be Markov the Magnificent, and while he's fine in his off-stage persona, it maybe would have been nice to see his on-stage persona have a bit more of a Copperfield razzle-dazzle. Jennifer Holton is wonderful here as Ellen, really delivering on what the script gives her and going above and beyond in showcasing her transition from a wallflower who's afraid to be who she really is to a fully blossomed woman. Her relationship with David is somewhat rushed. The film kinda ums and ahs with what to do with them for most of the first and second acts before putting them together around the midpoint of the second act. They date for what seems like an eternity, even though it really is only a few days in the film, and then they're suddenly engaged. It's a bit hectic. But on the whole, she does a more than decent and convincing job here, and I was astounded to find out that this was her last acting role after only 3 credits. The rest of the cast are decent enough. Joe Cirillo has a decent turn as Kirk, absolutely bringing weight and passion where required to a role that relied on it to carry the performance. He does a decent job, and it's just such a shame the film got so hung up on countryside walks with Ellen and David that it actually forgot to bother to make him a bit more of a focal point. It would have been nice to see him lose his cool or make a few more mistakes more consistently throughout the film to help make the transition from lead act of the carnival to drunk on his final warning a bit smoother. As it stands, he basically goes from leading the carnival to being a bit worried about his place to one scene where it's implied he's getting sloppy to full-blown drunk willing to get into chimp thievery to make ends meet. All of this unfolds across only a few days in the film. It's not explicitly stated how much time passes, but given it's the summer season and it's well underway at the time the film starts, the whole movie can't unfold in any longer than a 3-week window. And finally, the soundtrack. And what we have here is one of the most demented scores I've heard for a movie. It's mostly synthy, minimalist attempts at circus music, but it's not done particularly well. As a result, it sounds less like a score that's been written for a professional production, and more like some randomer was offered a couple of bottles of wild turkey to bash out the music for whatever Al needed to have bashed out. Circus music at the best of times has a bit of a demented edge to it, but badly played, bizarrely paced, entirely synth keyboard generated circus music is a whole other level of what on earth am I watching? For some reason, most of the sound effects in this movie are also sourced from video games, including Centipede and Galaga. It's just wild. There are several rumours around what happened to Carnival Magic. As mentioned earlier, it was produced with the aim of solely playing at children's matinee shows, but Beyond that, there were no plans for a home release, and once it had finished its theatrical run, it pretty much disappeared off the face of the earth. For the longest time, there were anecdotes that the film was illegally screened as backing footage for several punk bands during illegal gigs at a regional abandoned indie cinema. The interesting point being that the people attending the gigs stopped listening to the music and instead started watching the crazy talking chimp movie. The film remained the stuff of legends and was considered lost until the mid to late 2000s, when members of AGFA were asked if they were interested in a complete set of reels for the film that had been rescued from a cupboard from that exact same abandoned theatre. AGFA transferred and restored the film, where it received a premiere on TCM, much to the bewilderment of audience members. It was then followed up with an appearance on the revived MST3K, where it established and grew an even larger cult following. The film was eventually licensed out to Severin Films as part of their Al Adamson Masterpiece Collection Blu-ray box set released in June 2020. It also released a solo DVD release from Severin at the same time. Both are now considered out of print, with the solo DVD slowly creeping up in price. Honestly, if you want a copy, go and get one now, because it will go crazy very soon if it hasn't already. And the Adamson box set at the time of recording is going for frankly obscene money. Having contacted Severin to inquire about any chances of a potential reissue, I was politely told no. At the time they initially put it out, I couldn't afford it, and boy do I regret it now. I'd very much like to explore Adamson's work in more detail, because after seeing this, I have a lot more questions than answers. Carnival Magic feels like a made-up movie, and I think, realistically, 1983 was probably the last time you could get away with making a film so blatantly cheap, bizarre, and bordering on having the ASPCA and PETA raiding your set. It's a cacophonous experience that I'd love to see played out in an actual cinema sometime. If you have children, show them this movie. Let me know what they made of it. The younger the better. I'm genuinely intrigued to see what they'd make of this assault on the senses. With an all-over-the-place script, ugly cine, controversial themes, direction that's off the mark, and a soundtrack that could score a Five Nights at Freddy's game, I can only wholeheartedly recommend Carnival Magic. Dim the lights, grab a snack, and let the 85-minute-long monkey-based surrealism wash over you like so much hot vomit. Recommended.